podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello everyone and welcome to How Is the Podcast. It's Gav and you join us for this Sunday morning podcast as we're here to chat all about another Sunderland player that's on the way through the door. And it looks like Habib Diarra set to sign for Sunderland. Of course, nobody has missed that bit of news because it looks like we're going to break our transfer record to bring him into the club. And I thought, well, why not get on somebody who's a bit of an expert on the French league to give us some insight on this player. And when I spoke to this fella the other day, I said it'll not be long before we chat again. I didn't quite think it was going to be 2 or 3 days, but there we go. Sunderland are active in the transfer market and they're giving us plenty to talk about. We are once again joined by Alex Barker of The Athletic. Morning, Alex.
Good morning. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back on. The feedback on the last one was excellent, so it's very nice to be here.
Yes. So Habib Diarra is a player who I don't think many of us had seen coming up until about 48 hours ago, when it looked as though he was heading for Leeds United, perhaps, or maybe West Ham. He was linked with a bunch of other Premier League clubs. Sunderland weren't even mentioned in the conversation. And then arriving at the back post, there we are, to nod it in, 30-odd million euros, apparently. Looks like the medical's all done. We're just waiting for the announcement. Surely you didn't even see this one coming, Alex.
Yeah, I really didn't. I thought... I thought he was going to another Premier League club. And to be honest, as we'll discuss, Diarra as well has definitely gone under the radar in Ligue 1. So if you were to tell me that a club was going to buy a player from Strasbourg for 30 million, Diarra is actually one of the last players I would have picked. That's not to say he's bad or anything, don't worry. It's just, I think he's one of the least talked about players at that team, at least in the sort of circles I operate in.
Why do you think that is then? Is he a pretty, unflamboyant player? I don't know. What is it about Diarra that doesn't make him stand out so much?
So I think generally, like, just to sum it up, he's a jack of all trades. So I don't think he excels at one particular thing. This isn't to say there's a lack of detail we can go into, but Diarra is just pretty good at all areas of the game. While he is like a young player in that team, you have to remember Strasbourg, they are the youngest team in Europe. I think they're probably one of the youngest teams that's ever been assembled in the top 5 leagues. I think they had an average age last season between 21 and 22 years old. That's obviously because, for people who don't know, Strasbourg are Chelsea's sister club. And they've essentially been filled with Chelsea's young talent, and they're being used as almost like a farmers squad in a farmers league, as someone would say. But it does mean that Diarra, being a 21-year-old, he is just one of a sea of 21-year-old super kids. And also, it doesn't help as well if we're talking about his reputation. He's played alongside Andre Santos this season. Andre Santos is going back to Chelsea now, and that's because he has probably been one of the best midfielders in Ligue 1 for the past year. And having to play alongside him stealing all of the limelight, it's understandable why Diarra will go under the radar. In fact, I'll be honest, he went under my radar for most of the season. It's only in the last month or so, when I've seen the interest starting to tick up again, that I've started putting the research in to make sure I know him as well as the other players.
So Diarra then is a player, like I say, I don't think many of us have heard of. And if you read the stories on this transfer and you read what's being said about it, it looks as though that Sunderland are committing the vast majority of the money that was recouped from the Joe Bellingham sale to pay for this deal. Now, with Diarra, we are, I guess, looking for a replacement for Joe Bellingham. Would that be accurate? Is he that type of player, a box-to-box number 8, perhaps?
He's a difficult player to describe, but box-to-box is one of the few things I can concretely say about him. So, to give you a bit more detail, so Strasbourg last season, they played... if you've watched Chelsea, they played in a similar way to them. Liam Rosenior, the former Hull City boss, he arrived last summer, and his task was essentially to play in a very similar way to Chelsea. Think of it in the way you'd want your youth academy to play in the same system as your first team, so it should be easier to take players from there into your first team setup. So Strasbourg played the same 3-2-4-1 system, and at first Diarra played as a number 10, which I believe is where Joe Bellingham started playing for Sunderland, playing a bit further forward. But across the season, Diarra started moving backwards, and he went from being one of the 2 10s in this sort of box midfield to being one of the defensive midfielders, playing alongside Santos, who I mentioned before. I'd say, generally speaking, he tends to do his best work on the right-hand side of the midfield. He's even deputised at wing-back as well this season, like right-back, I'd say. And I think that's because Diarra's, I know he says he's jack of all trades, but there's 2 traits I think that sum it up well, which is he's ball carrying and he's off the ball movement. He's someone who I think can ride pressure really well and can carry the ball for long distances because of that. And he's also someone who makes quite unselfish runs. So if he plays a pass to a right winger, he'll make that run in behind the fullback coming to press the right winger. So it gives a bit of space for the right winger. In this case, it would be Dylan Bakwa for Strasbourg to cut inside, maybe play a cross. Or maybe he might drop back and offer a passing option. He's someone who looks to offer a passing move, essentially. And I think he's quite an intelligent player in that respect. But like I said, I think if you're looking for the most eye-catching trait, it's his ability to burst through space, have players coming and try and challenge him, and carry the ball forward and not lose it.
That's quite important in the Premier League, isn't it? When you're trying to adapt. This is something that we talked about on yesterday's pod, me and Chris, about the need to put athletic players into this squad, because the Premier League, the big difference we keep getting told is just the sheer ability and but athleticism and strength of a lot of the players at that level. And even in scrappy games, you have to be able to physically compete. Would it be accurate to say he'll certainly add some of those attributes to our squad?
I think so. This is a really good point to bring up, and it's a good point for me to tangent about Liga, because I know we spoke about the other day that Sunderland are probably going to recruit a lot of players from France. And one of the reasons I think that's a smart idea, other Premier League clubs have been doing this for a while, the last couple of years now, so it's not exactly new, but Liga, by a lot of people, is considered as the second most physical league in Europe behind the Premier League. Because, I mean, I think Mauricio Pochettino, when he managed PSG, he even called it the most physical league in Europe. I think Lionel Messi said something to a similar sentiment when he was at PSG as well. And of course, physicality is a bit of a buzzword, right? But I think in Liga, and what that means is the tendency for games to go back and forth. The fact there's a lot of young players in there who are full of energy, and a lot of big, strong athletes too. And that's where Diarra fits in, and that's why I also think he'd probably be a nice fit in the Premier League. It's kind of like, this is actually a move, as well as Bulka, that gets me quite excited to watch Sunderland next season, because if you compare this business to, let's say, Southampton last summer, when they came up from the Championship, I remember their recruitment felt quite focused around sort of English players, and keeping some of their Championship players in the league. And to me, it was like, as we discussed before, there's a big gap between these leagues, and it feels like you're setting yourself up to fail a bit. Whereas Sunderland seem to be thinking, how can we add players into our team who are probably suited to Premier League environment? And, they might not be cheap, but they're not like 50 million buys. And can we basically quickly get our way up to Premier League level through these players? And Diarra is that sort of adaptable player who has the physical qualities, who should be able to adapt to the league.
Notice as well, he's Strasbourg's captain, isn't he, at 21-year-old, which is quite interesting to me, because one, not many teams would give the captaincy to a 21-year-old. Sunderland, I think Daniel was 21 when he got the captaincy, so we can relate in that regard. And obviously in the regard you mentioned before about them being one of the youngest teams in Europe, I think that would probably apply to Sunderland too. I think we're the youngest team to ever be promoted out of the EFL. But interesting to me that he was given the captaincy there at Strasbourg. What do you think that says about him as a character then?
That's a brilliant setup to some wonderful information about him. So you're right, Diarra's as captain Strasbourg this season, but he's been a leader long before that. So to give you a bit of background, he was born in Senegal, I believe, and then moved to France, to Mulhouse, which is about an hour away from Strasbourg, when he was 5 years old. And then I think when he was about 14 or 15, he got picked up by Strasbourg. And this is obviously way before Chelsea even take an interest in the club or him. But Strasbourg's youth academy hasn't had the most success in recent years. And in this, I think in the first iteration of Bulka's team, Bulka, the people who own Chelsea, He is one of only 2 Strasbourg Academy graduates to have made it to the team. But he'd always been very highly rated, and that's why he managed to break into that team. And even from that point, he was considered as like someone who's quite a quiet leader. I think that in his own words, he always said he kept himself to himself when he was growing up, but now has started to take on a bit more vocal role. And in that first year when Chelsea took over Strasbourg, when it was really tumultuous as well, because Strasbourg, they may not be the most successful club in France, but they have got a pretty strong fan base, and those fans did not react well when Chelsea took over. He was one of the people actually meeting the Ultras group in crisis meetings to try and soothe things over after the takeover, and then that relationship between the club and the fan base. That's at least according to, I think, reports from Get French Football News at the time. So he's been a leader for quite a while, actually. So it does speak to his character being like quite a well-adjusted guy. Also going back to the fact that he's had to move to France at a young age. When he went to Strasbourg, he often spent weeks without seeing his parents as well. So I think, like we were talking the other day about how Bulka would adapt to moving countries. Again, I think Diarra is that sort of player. Sunderland have identified and gone, they think this will be a good character fit for the team.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I think when you get promoted, you want to add leaders to your group, and signing the captain of another team is one way to go at that. And I want to just touch on something you've mentioned a couple of times, which is that link with Chelsea, because I read quite a lot of people who were surprised that Chelsea weren't interested in taking him, because the most obvious thing being that link. But do you think, what's your thoughts on that? And what's your thoughts on maybe this being because Sunderland are, quite happy to be a stepping stone for players to move on. Could this just be, a move which obviously it suits Sunderland because we get a good player, but then you look at down the line, if he does very well at Sunderland, Chelsea and the likes of Chelsea will be interested in Diarra if he does well in the Premier League. Yeah,
that's an interesting point to bring up, because before they took over, according to L'Equipe, Chelsea actually were already highly rating, not sure that's a phrase, but you know what I mean, Diarra. And they actually blocked a sale before they took over to Wolves, and as they were taking over, blocked him moving to Lens or Wolves for about 25 million euros. So they have clearly rated him highly for a long time. To purely speculate here why he's not gone to Chelsea this summer, I think it's because for the majority of the season he hadn't shown traits which I think would help for their team. So I think one, for example, is his passing. I think at the start of the season he was played further forward, as I said, as a number 10, and I wasn't as much of a fan of his passing because I think he would be a bit insecure on it, and that's both receiving the ball, looking to pass it backwards to a teammate, or looking to thread a through ball through to a teammate running in behind. I think his passing was a bit insecure there. But in 2025, I think that's actually taken quite a big improvement. And he is now trusted to receive the ball under pressure where he's back to goal and play passes first time, often on both feet as well. So it's been quite a notable improvement there. And I wonder if maybe Chelsea made their decisions on their squad a bit earlier in the year and Diarra didn't fit into their plans. And maybe if he'd shown this improvement a bit earlier, they might have thought twice about it. At the same time, they've also got like ridiculous midfield depth. As I said, they made the decision early to bring back Andre Santos this summer because he's been such a standout talent in the Strasbourg team. And even he's at the Club World Cup struggling to get minutes. I think he's on I just don't think he's ready yet for that first team. So I think if Diarra had moved, it would have been even further away from the first team.
Perhaps, yeah. I think that's probably accurate, isn't it? Chelsea are operating in a different in a different pool to Sunderland at the minute, and maybe this is it. But I think with a lot of players who come to Sunderland, it's going to be, especially now, it's going to be the case that will be the big sell to these players will be, if you come to Sunderland, we can get you that big move in a couple of years, and most importantly, we aren't going to stand in your way. We're quite happy to facilitate that. If you hold up your end of the bargain and you do well for us. I say this because Leeds did look very, very close to signing him. By all intents and purposes, they were virtually thereabouts. They offered in the end the same, if you believe what you read, they offered the same amount of money in the end as Sunderland had offered, and the player had chosen to come to Sunderland. Why do you think that might be?
Oh, that's a good question. not known the details there, I mean, you guys have mentioned you've got that strong French connection at the club, and I feel like that is going to play a big role still. Although at the same time as well, say Racinha, the manager of Strasbourg, I mentioned, he his plight have changed now, but for the first few months of his time there, did not speak good French. So I think he conversed a lot in English and had to use a lot of alternative ways of communicating. So it's not like Diarra wouldn't have had experience, with a language barrier to speak, but I imagine that growing French connection at Sunderland has probably played a big role there. Whereas Leeds, I think it's that connection just doesn't exist, right? That would be my guess.
We've had a question actually on Twitter from Jason Beattie around the deal, and I thought I'd ask you this one. He says, what impact will most likely be that the AFCON have on the deal and further recruits in midfield? This one's interesting because obviously he represents Senegal, the African Cup of Nations coming up in January. More so to me, my mind would be, if we are signing players knowing that they could potentially be playing at the African Cup of Nations, does that impact on the business that happens from out the French league? Because there's a lot of African internationals in the French league, and clubs want players all year round. They don't want to lose players for 5, 6, 7 games of the season. What's your thoughts on that sort of thing when it comes to recruiting players out of France?
This is always it can be a controversial topic, right? I get why as fans you signed a player for a lot of money, you want them to be available all year round. So what I would say to that is I always think this does get a little overstated. When it actually comes around to the African Cup of Nations, you often find out the players only miss 3-4 games at maximum, and that can feel like a lot of time, but in the grand scheme of things, it's less than a quarter, way less than a quarter of a season, if my maths is correct. And I would say as well, if we're speaking specifically about Habib Diarra, he played most games last season. I think he only missed 3 or 4 through injury. So, okay, he might miss a few through the African Cup of Nations, but if he's going to be available for all of the rest of the games, does it really matter that much? I think it's the sort of thing where, okay, you accept he might be missing for some games, but overall, it's still, he's still going to be there and still going to be adding a big positive to your team.
Yeah. Obviously, he shot into the limelight a little bit recently, didn't he, with his goal against England in the friendly between Senegal and England. But, I did, to be honest, that was the first time I'd ever heard of him as someone who doesn't really watch the French league. But I presume you watched that game. How did you think he did?
Oh, I didn't watch that game, to be fair. To be a bit more human at the moment, while I watch most Ligue 1 games, when it comes to international football, I am having a holiday, and I'm only watching it when it comes to international tournaments. So I can't speak to that, I'm afraid.
Did you see his goal, though?
I've not, no. How good was it?
Oh, well, it was a good finish anyways, but it does make me wonder about his ability to score goals, because when you look at the stats on paper, he doesn't score a great amount. I mean, I think he got 4 or 5 last season. I haven't got the numbers in front of us. And obviously, you need goals from all over the pitch when you play in the Premier League, because particularly as a team who aren't going to have the ball a lot, you need people to chip in as and when. Would you say he's much of a goal threat as a midfielder?
I'd say so, to be fair. I think with not just his goals and assists, but all of his statistics, you have to take them with a pinch of salt. Even the ones, I say that because he's shifted positions, obviously, right? He's moved from the number 10 position into the number 6 position, essentially, across the season. So he's gone from being one of the secondary attacking threats, let's say, to actually being one of the more defensive players in the team. So that's obviously going to take a big impact on his ability to score goals and assist. But what I'll also say about him, with the caveat aside that I think he has been taking penalties this season, so I want to say 3 of his goals across the year came from penalties for Strasbourg, at least. But he still has quite nice tendencies, I think, in the final third. Like I said, he's quite intelligent off the ball, particularly on that right-hand side, making underlapping and overlapping runs. So when he's given that freedom, I think he can get into quite dangerous positions to create. And also, I think he's quite nice at arriving for cutbacks as well, around the edge of the box too. So even though the goals and assists aren't there, it doesn't mean that he won't be able to contribute in that regard. And just extending on this point, about the statistics, whenever there's a player who shifted positions, me as an analyst, what I always try and do is look at a few different stats that are less likely to shift, I find, between positions. For example, like aerial win rate, ground duel win rate, how many duels they win on the ground in the air, their dribble success rate. Of course, these things shift because you might go from winning headers against centre-backs to full-backs, or like duelling with them. Even these stats as well, I think, really don't paint a picture at all. Like Diarra, is someone I would describe as a pretty decent dribbler. That's different to ball carrying. I think he's a good ball carrier where he's got space in front of him. He might have pressure from behind and he's able to resist that, power forward. Maybe he's a bit less successful when he has to take someone on, but he has like a 28% success rate from last season, but it's around 50% the year before. So big range in success there in terms of his dribbles. And I definitely think that the truth lies somewhere between. It's the same with his ground duel success rate, his tackle success rate. That's around the low 40s. Again, Sunderland fans might see a stat like that and think, oh, hang on, what have we got here? I think that might also be from playing as an attacking midfielder. And B, when you watch him, he's a really strong guy. I think he's about 6 foot tall, and he's got the power to just bulldoze players off the pitch, which is another trait you think would suit well for the Premier League. So taking that point about the goals and assists, I think this is just a good point to mention that basically all of his statistics last season, they have really strong caveats attached to them. And you have to, I think more than ever with this player, you have to watch them to really gauge how good they are.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of statistics and the eye test, again, there's that phrase. Where does he sort of pass in your eyes? Where does he excel?
That's a good question. I think it's definitely the ball carrying that I've mentioned. I think I would like to extend upon his play under pressure, which is something we mentioned earlier. That I said I don't think he was that good at earlier in the season and has improved. I can actually tie that to something he said. I think it's relatively recently. There was an interview with WIW Sport, which I'm not going to lift too much from because I recommend actually you and other fans look this up afterwards. He gives a really good in-depth interview here, just on himself as a character and in the Strasbourg team. But he was asked in this about what does he do to analyse himself, and one of the things he mentioned was so the agency he works with, they provide him with video analysis, and they pointed out earlier in the season that he essentially wasn't scanning enough. Scanning, for those who don't know, is just quite simply checking your shoulders before receiving the ball. Sounds simple, but a lot of footballers do not do it. And they pointed out and said, you're not doing this enough. You're often receiving the ball unaware. And he says, like, since then, he now never does that. He never asks for a pass without checking his shoulders. And that has really improved across the season now. So when you tell me where he passes in the eye test, I think we could talk about the strength, we talk about the ball carrying, like I've mentioned, that ability to pop up in the final third. That I think just in general, this ability to find weaknesses and improve on them is a really big strength for him. And it's why I would describe him as that jack of all trades. I find it quite hard to actually poke holes in his game. It's not to say he's a world beater. It's not even to say he'll be a success in the Premier League. I just think he's a player without obvious weaknesses.
Who else? So for anybody who hasn't really seen him at all, other than the obligatory YouTube compilations, which make every player look like world beaters, who would you say he compares to in terms of style, in terms of the way, a name that people would know as a player?
So he himself thinks he sees a lot of himself in N'Golo Kante. Not just in the way he plays, but also the personality. Those are his words, not mine. Which I do kind of see. I don't think he's quite as quick buzzing around the pitch, but he's definitely got that energy, like in the duels, where it's like he just never goes away. He's like a fly who just doesn't stop buzzing around you, right? But at the same time, I also think maybe he's a bit more an offensively minded player than Kante was. That he just, not to say he's better going forward, let's say, but just someone who has his eye a bit more on contributing in the final third. In that respect, I've got a very, very niche name, which probably isn't helpful at all, but I do not care because I'm going to go with it anyway. Wolves signed someone last January from RAS called Azor Matasiwa, and he's a player who played in central midfield, also played as a number 10, and I just see a lot of him in Diarra, where they're two players essentially who are very well-rounded technically, very well-rounded physically, and they're able to play basically across the midfield. And Matasi was also someone who's played as a number 10 and just arrived at the back post or just arrived for cutbacks for goals. So it's that well-rounded player who can just contribute in all areas of the pitch.
Yeah, I think people might be quite happy to hear him compared to N'Golo Kante. Even if he's half the player N'Golo Kante was, I think we'll be happy. Just to go back to something I mentioned at the top, the fee, it's a lot of money. Sunderland have never paid this amount of money for a footballer. I think it's almost double what we've ever paid for a footballer. I know the Premier League's changed since we were last here. That big fees are just part and parcel now. But it does show a massive commitment from Sunderland, doesn't it? And the rumoured agreement is a 5-year deal, which tells you, the club see a lot of potential in this guy. And, knowing the way we work, we wouldn't be signing a player for that amount of money if we didn't think we could sell him on for a lot more down the line. What do you think about the fee? Because I've seen a lot of Leeds fans trying to make themselves feel better about this by saying, they're overpaying, even though it's been reported that Leeds actually matched our offer. But it's interesting because, like I say, we don't know a lot about this guy. Are we paying for potential here, given he's 21-year-old?
You are to an extent, but I do think I think there's two things I'd look into here. Two things I look into to say the fee isn't too bad. I mean, the first one actually isn't on this list, but I must say I'm quite detached from these fees now. 26 million to me that's quite cheap, actually. I'm very much living in the Premier League world of transfers, thinking Declan Rice going for over 100 million. Is there £100 million between Declan Rice and this guy? Maybe, but that's the sort of fees I'm usually living at. But yeah, the first one is age, and it's not just potential, right? Let's take a different route here. Let's assume Diarra doesn't work out at Sunderland. Okay, let's say you play him in central midfield as a number 6. It's clear he's not working there. Okay. And Sunderland thinking, how are we going to keep this guy's value up? How are we going to get more out of him? Or worst case, how are we going to find a way to sell him for money? So the age is obviously helpful because if you buy him now and he doesn't work out for 2 years, let's say, by then he'll be 23, 24 years old. He'll still have quite a lot of resale value there. So it's not just buying potential. You're investing a lot of money into someone who shouldn't be losing a lot of value, barring, freak injuries or whatever. The other thing I think you're buying with Diarra, as I've kind of hinted at throughout this, is versatility. So one of the worst crimes you can commit in football transfers is buying a player and immediately not having a good place for them in the team, or having only one position they fit in, which means if a manager comes in, let's say they play a 4-2-3-1, they play very well in the number 10. A manager comes in and goes, actually, I like playing a 4-3-3. I don't like having a number 10. Then that player just immediately becomes surplus to requirements, right? The positive with Diarra, as we've mentioned, he's played as a right wing back, he's played as a number 6, he's played as a number 10 as well. He's a very versatile guy. He's just a very well-rounded, athletic, technical player, which means, okay, maybe he comes into Sunderland. Maybe it becomes clear he doesn't work out as a defensive midfielder. That's fine. You can use him further forward. He can have an impact in the final third as a number 10. Maybe he's just that guy who can fit in all other places, as like fullback, for example, if there are injuries, or maybe even on the wing against teams. Let's say you're playing against, a top 6 team or a team you want to press or defend against very well. We'll say Arsenal, for example. Maybe you play Diarra as a right winger and he's just there to provide a bit of forward threat, but first and foremost, provide physicality out wide and defend well. So you're buying someone who, in theory, shouldn't immediately become surplus to requirements with a managerial or system change. He's a flexible guy. And again, that comes back as well to his time at Strasbourg. I mentioned they play a lot like Chelsea at the moment, and that's because of the way the team wants to be run. They want players to easily step from Strasbourg to Chelsea, to playing style-wise. That wasn't always the case. Strasbourg, in fact, have been known, I'd say, as like a French Burnley, I'd say. It was only a few years ago they were lobbing long balls up to a guy called Ludovic Ajorc, who was 6'8". And even the year before last season, under Patrick Vieira, again, they were a team who were a bit more stodgy, a bit more counter-attacking. And Diarra's come through all of this and kept his place in the team. So it shows he's not only versatile positionally, but versatile through different ways of playing as well.
How much is this going to impact Strasbourg then? Are they going, the money's, it's a lot of money, but as you mentioned, they're owned by Chelsea. Is this going to have a big effect on them in terms of the budget they've got and also losing a player? Is it going to put a big hole in their team that they might struggle to fill?
I mean, yeah, potentially. There is a bit of a joke at the moment that is the home of Revolution France, and you might see a bit of a revolt from Strasbourg because last season they came very close to qualifying for Champions League football and ended up, I believe, with nothing in the end, no European football, because of a late season drop-off. And throughout the season, there was a bit of an undercurrent of, Strasbourg under Chelsea, this actually could work. And the fans still protesting, but quietly beginning to accept we're going in the right direction. Now they've lost Andre Santos, they've lost Diarra, so two of their best midfielders. I'm sure they're going to lose other players as well. And they might just get ripped apart and then be fed more 19, 20-year-olds from Chelsea. Yes, this has a potential to go very bad for Strasbourg, and it might be a protest that's worth keeping an eye on across the next season.
Yeah, I'm just in general interested now, very much so in the French league, because it looks like it's a lot of untapped potential there, and it looks like Sunderland are trying to make the most of it. And we've had a few questions on Twitter, and I thought I'll throw these to you while I've got you. Joseph Hurd has asked, if we were able to sign a centre-back from a League One club, who would it be? I mean, who, for a newly promoted team, we're looking to add probably some similar motor Diarra, but at the back, a big, athletic, strong central defender who can really complement what we've already got in Dan Ballard and Luke O'Nien. Is there anybody who immediately springs to mind?
I'm trying to think of realistic ones. Even though you've managed to bring in Marcin Bulka from Nice, I'm trying not to think of Champions League level players because I'm not sure they're realistic. If you're thinking of young players who might good resale value as well, but also hopefully make an impact now, there's Jeremy Jacquet at Rennes, who's a 19-year-old who played a lot of first-team football last season. He played mainly in the back three, but he did look very comfortable physically and on the ball. I think he's a centre-back who's definitely going to grow in value next season. There's also Nathan Zeze too, which I know you might have heard of Scouted. They're a publication that covers young players. The guys who run that are very big fans of him. Centre-back at Nantes, again, a bit like a French Burnley, a team that plays a lot of long balls, and he might be someone who's suited to sort of back to the wall defending.
I think similarly as well, we've had a question from Rocky, and he's asked you to recommend a right winger and a left back currently playing in France. I don't know if there's anybody who springs to mind who might be on Sunderland's radar.
Yeah, I'm loving these tests at the moment. For a right winger, someone who might be undervalued at the moment is Edon Jagrover at Lille. He was injured last season, so didn't play that much. But the year before, he racked up quite a lot of goal contributions. I think at least over 10. He's a very left-footed player, not got much of a right foot, but I'm not sure that matters so much at the lower reaches of the Premier League. He's very good on his left, that classic inverted winger. Think of Hakim Ziyech cutting inside, playing passes and crosses into the box. He might be someone that's pretty good. And left back was the other one you mentioned. That's an interesting one. I'm trying to think of youngsters. A lot of them have been poached recently. Adrien Truffert, Rennes was looking really good, but he's now off to Bournemouth to replace Milos Kerkez. Other than him, I guess there might be Mercado at Lens. He's more of a left wing back, to be fair, but he has pretty good energy going back and forth, so I don't doubt he could be more of a left back. He's also much better defensively than offensively, I'd say. So that's another one I'd be potentially looking at. I'm going to take this opportunity as well. I'm not sure a question is coming up, but one of my favourite players in Ligue 1 was one actually you got rid of last summer, and you've officially got rid of this summer, Pierre Ekwa. I know there was no chance of him going. Correct me if I'm wrong. He made an error in the game against Newcastle a couple of seasons ago, so he's not very welcome back. But I will say he was brilliant last season. If I didn't, if I hadn't known about his background at Sunderland, in fact I didn't when I tweeted about him originally. I was like, why is he not at a Premier League club? I'm very surprised if he doesn't end up in the Premier League sooner or later, and that'll be a fun game.
We haven't actually sold him yet. I think it is expected that he will leave, but. If he's had a good season, they may well bring him back, and I think people listening will be surprised to hear that because we've obviously taken our eye off him for a little bit and not really noticed too much. Well, did he get relegated with Saint at the end?
He got relegated, and I appreciate I've kept you a long time, so I'll very quickly say he played as like a backs-to-the-wall defensive midfielder, and then a Norwegian guy called Erik Korlund came in halfway through the season and got Son Etienne playing like Barcelona without scoring goals. But in that, he looked, he was playing Sergio Busquets role, right? And he was really good on and off the ball. One of my favourite players in Ligue 1 last season. And I'm not sure he's officially left, but there were reports in France that Son Etienne, you're right, did get relegated in the end. They were coming from a really low point halfway through the season after the managerial change anyway. But there are reports I'm reading, they were planning to activate their buy option, but just so they could sell him on because they know they could get a huge profit on him. So I think, if nothing else, that speaks to how good of a season he's had. If the fact they sell him and see the potential money in him.
I think on his day, Pierre on a Sunderland shirt was outstanding, but you would either get the real extreme brilliant performance where he looked like prime Paul Pogba at times, the way he glided around the pitch and scored some great goals for us. But then there were other times where he just switched off, and I think Tony Mowbray, the manager at the time, was quite outspoken about that, and he wasn't scared to mention it in the press that Pierre's, sometimes I have to slap him. I think what he said was sometimes I have to slap him around the face and remind him, you're in a game. Like, I think that it's that concentration level that's let him down in Sunderland, in the Sunderland shirt. But you never know; he could come back in pre-season even just to have a look at him and see how he does. And if he's had a good season, I'm sure the club know about it. But I think people will be really interested, intrigued to hear from you that he's had a good season, because I didn't know that. I didn't know that he'd played well for them. So. Yeah, an interesting one with Pierre. Maybe we can save ourselves a little bit of money if he's come back a better player. You never know. He might still have a future yet at Sunderland. Yeah,
maybe. Or maybe this is where Sunderland fans listen to go, I knew Ligue 1 was rubbish. If Ekwar's doing well there, then that's terrible.
Alex, brilliant. Thanks once again for your insight. Let's see how it goes. It looks like, as we're sitting recording this, it looks like the deal is about done. I think when Fabrizio Romano tweets the green tick, we all kind of expect it just to be a formality and for Sunderland to announce the player, and it looks like he's here to be a Sunderland player in the future in the Premier League. And fingers crossed, anyways, when we catch up again, we're talking about him in a Sunderland shirt and doing pretty well. You never know. I say again, when we catch up again, it's probably going to be another couple of days, mate, isn't it? Let's be honest, at this rate.
Yeah, it may well be, and yeah. Thanks again for having me on. I'm more than happy to come back on and talk about Ligue 1 players. It's, as you can tell, it's something I love doing.
That's enough to get you up on a Sunday morning, isn't it? That's what it is. Thanks to listeners. Thanks for joining us once again. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. We've got loads coming up over the coming days, so make sure you get subscribed to How We're the Podcast. We'll be reacting to any news which drops across the summer. As you can see, we are busy at the minute because Sunderland appear to be ramping things up, and over the coming days you would expect a couple of these signings are going to be announced just in time for pre-season starting. So make sure you get subscribed, make sure you catch up on everything that we've already got on the feeds this week. We'll see you on the next one.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.